Kia ora and welcome everyone. Welcome to this edition of our Lunch and Learn series. And today I am joined by the fabulous, tireless Chandra Harrison from Access Advisors. Kia ora, Chandra.
Kia ora, Vic. Thank you for having me
Thanks.
along.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining, and thank you to everyone who's here watching us today. Just before we kick off, I just want to let you all know there is a Q&A function. So if you want to ask Chandra any questions as we go along, just pop them in the Q&A and I'll relay them to her later in the session. So let's just start, Chandra. First up, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your wonderful mahi?
Thanks, Vic. I'm Chandra and I'm the Managing Director of Access Advisors. And what we do is that we help organisations all around the motu to improve their digital accessibility. A little bit of background about me. I live down in Otautahi, Christchurch, and I'm a Southern girl, born and bred. I spent a lot of time overseas working in the US and the UK and returned home about 11 years ago. And when I came home, the accessibility wasn't really something that people knew. And so I've spent the last 10, 11 years trying to help push that agenda and help people become more digitally accessible for people who have any kind of access needs.
Awesome. So we're here to talk about digital accessibility, as you said.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean?
It's a good question, Vic. What I would say is when people ask me, I kind of try and explain it that it's kind of talking about any product that has a digital interface, whether that is a website or an app or software or a kiosk or a teller machine, whatever it might be. Anything that has a digital interface, we need to be considering various different aspects to make sure that people who have certain disabilities or who use a variety of different types of assistive technology can use them. So, for example, if we think about somebody who is blind, if they go to a money machine, the interface there is visual. So what has happened is a lot of blind people can hear the interface by plugging in their headphones into the teller machine. And so they can still use that machine without anyone helping them just by using voice. And yes, the new FPOS terminals, those standard, sort of flat-faced teller machines, there's no FPOS machines, there's no tactile information. So you can then get it to use speech. So really what we're looking at is how can we make that digital interface as easy to use as possible for everyone, whether they are blind, whether they have low vision, whether they're deaf, whether they've got dexterity issues, anything like that. So we just use the psychology and the physiology aspects to work out how to make those interfaces better. And we work with organisations to try and do that and help them have access to more potential customers or get their message further.
So that's a really good point because many organizations consider developing their apps or websites to be more accessible as a nice to have, and
Mm.
often that line in the budget gets dropped. If you were talking to one of them, what would you tell them about why accessibility is so important and how it impacts people with disabilities in their daily lives here in Aotearoa, New Zealand?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, and this is what we hear a lot. So we often hear people say, "Oh, well, we just need to get out the MVP, and we just don't have, we're not prioritizing accessibility at the moment." So there's a whole lot of bits to unpack in that, and the first thing is that people often consider accessibility as a big effort that needs to be made and a big cost line. But in general, if we actually weave accessibility into that whole product development life cycle, then it actually shouldn't increase the cost too much. Yes, it will be a little bit of an increase, but it shouldn't be a whole hell of a lot. Where it becomes very expensive is if you don't consider it in your MVP, or you don't consider it right up front, and then you have to consider a digital accessibility because maybe you're required to meet the requirements of offshore vendors. Reworking will cost a lot of money. So actually, one thing I would say is including that line item from the get-go is a hell of a lot cheaper than having to add that in later. And the other thing is, if we think about the fact that at this particular point in time, we've got 24% of New Zealand's population state that they have a permanent disability. Then we've got all of the people who don't declare that they've got a disability. So a lot of people with dyslexia or neurodivergence don't register as disabled because they don't feel necessarily that they have a disability. So we've got the ones who aren't registered. We've also got the people who don't even know that they are disabled, or they haven't realized that they might have dyslexia or neurodivergence. So we're looking at least a quarter of the population. So let's say, the population of Tamaki Makaurau, who may be being restricted from using your product or completely blocked from using your product. And at the moment, given the commercial realities, if we have the opportunity to open up to a bigger market or reduce the costs of online, on the phone or bricks and mortar kind of transactions, every business should be prioritizing digital accessibility to reduce their costs, open up their potential market, make sure that they're actually doing the right thing as well. We know that there's a lot more desire to work in for-purpose organizations. We know that certainly the millennials that are entering the job market, they want to do work that is important, that matters. And if an organization prioritizes accessibility, then hopefully that is something that will, really push it. So there's a lot of reasons, but the biggest one that I think is it's the right thing to be doing, right? How can we decide who can and can't get online and order, their groceries or pay their power bill or whatever? Who are we to decide that? So yeah.
Especially when you say 24% are registered with a disability, and then there are so many other people with different neurodivergent divergent afflictions that they're not registered or not counted, right?
Yep.
That's a lot of the population, eh?
Well, it is a lot of the population, and there's a lot of the conversation that goes on around that is we've got people who have access needs right now, and then those that will at some point. If we're lucky, we're all going to age. And I mean, it's a privilege to get up to grow old, but more and more access needs start sneaking in there. Can't hear quite so well, takes a bit longer to process information, not as up on the IT, eyesight starts to deteriorate. So we will all eventually have an access need. And also, what about the temporary ones, right? So I broke my arm a few years ago, and for however long, it was nearly 2 months, I actually could only use things with one hand. And it really makes you slow down and think, actually, there's a lot that can change to help everybody, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's really awesome. So you talked about you broke your arm, and earlier you spoke about blind people with using ATM machines. What are some of the other common barriers people with disabilities face when they're using websites or apps or digital tools, and how can we start addressing them?
So if we look at it from a fundamental basis, right, we know that things like, and most people hopefully on the call know that good color contrast between the text and the background This is vital. Now, this is a really simple thing that we can get right. It's a really simple thing that isn't rocket science, that doesn't actually take a great degree of digital accessibility knowledge. We have the rules, and there's tools out there where people can basically have their color palette. They can test whether or not those colors should be used together, and if they're not, they need to tweak them just a little bit. That's something that simple is actually one of the most common issues in digital accessibility that we find. But it could also be people who are neurodivergent, certainly people who are on the autistic spectrum, and making sure that the interface design is really simple and clean and clear, so that you're helping support people to get to where they need to go and do what they need to do in a way that kind of makes sense. I always think that one of the biggest things with digital accessibility is it is about doing design and development with a real mindful understanding of all of the different types of access needs that are out there. It's not relearning a skill, it's applying that basic knowledge that you were taught at the beginning to consider all user needs. And the unfortunate thing is that, people with disabilities and access needs haven't always been considered when people have designed their interfaces.
So can you share with us an example? You don't need to name the company or anything, but an example of when digital accessibility has been done right in your experience, where inclusive design significantly improved user experience and engagement.
Awesome. Thanks. That's a good one. I can use an example. So back in COVID, we all remember COVID, lovely time. So they created, remembering that Health New Zealand or Te Whatu Ora or whoever it was at the time, they had such a really short time frame. So an app was created, and the app was created, quickly and to do a job. And then somebody went, oh, we need to think about people with access needs. So they asked two experts who happened to be blind screen reader users to review the app. But both of these people were experts and they knew how to get around things. So they weren't necessarily mainstream access users.
Right.
So they came to us because they got a lot of complaints from people who were blind, low vision, older, who had dexterity issues, who were having problems with the app. So what we did is that we reviewed the app against the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is kind of like that global standard. And we helped them to improve the app to a point where the blind communities were actually very happy to be using it, because what we did was we started including haptic feedback. So instead of just relying on a visual cue that something has happened, you also had that haptic stuff as well. And it was reviewing something that already existed, which meant that we had to go back and retrofit. Whereas if we kind of got involved at the beginning, we could have helped them weave that the understanding of digital accessibility in from the beginning.
Yeah, so that's really good on you for giving the government some positive feedback as well.
Indeed, but I mean, I think a lot of our clients are government organisations. I think that's just because they know that they need to be doing this. We also get a few large corporate organisations who either have been mandated somewhere to do the digital accessibility. The other big area that we're seeing now is organisations that sell software and they want to sell it overseas. And to be able to sell anything digital to the United States or Europe or the UK, you have to meet those web content accessibility guidelines. But here in New Zealand, there isn't a strong mandate for that. So what we're finding is organisations have tried to sell offshore, and then they've been told they need this compliance report. And so they then come back to us and say, what's going on? Again, often it's at the end of the process, and then there can be quite a lot of rework that has to happen for them to meet it. But, we're getting more and more people who are going, oh, we know we need to do that at the start, which is good.
So quickly before we go to the Q&A, because there are quite a few questions for you there, I just wanted to ask you about those big corporates or the companies that are investing in this space.
Yep.
How can they measure the effectiveness of their accessibility efforts? And what are some of the key standards or benchmarks, like you were just talking about, that they should be aiming to meet?
Right. So the big one, the main thing that they can that large corporates want to do is that they want to benchmark where they are right now, and on it from an accessibility perspective. So we are testing against the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. You can't say enough about these things. They've been around since 1999, have evolved over as technology has evolved. So they often want to just measure where they start and where they get to once they've sort of started to do the mahi and fix things. So that's one way of proving that they've had an improvement. The other thing is that they are seeing less complaints from people who have access needs. The other thing is that they're having an increase in clients who are, getting involved and becoming members and so on. So I think that there are lots and lots of different metrics that we can use. It's very hard, however, to quantify if there's a whole lot of stuff happening at the same time. So what we always sort of, use is, has it improved? Have your customer service calls reduced? Have your complaints reduced? All of those different types of metrics that you can put in place.
Nice. Okay, I'm going to jump to the Q&A and start asking you these questions.
Okay, cool.
First one, how can service providers best ensure that their online forms and fields are accessible to people who are low vision or blind? Are there resources out there to help?
So the answer to that is, great question. Forms are one of the biggest issues that we come across, right? So in short, given that we're with the IT professionals, what we need to do is make sure that all of the elements in a form are coded correctly so that the screen reader knows and tells the screen reader user what to do. So for example, we need a label. We need to know whether it's required or not. We need to know what kind of input field it is. And once we've got that sorted, somebody who's a screen reader user can just come on in and the screen reader will tell them what to do. The screen reader is assistive tech that basically is turning the text to speech in the background. Screen reader. So that's the big thing with forms. Yes, there are lots of resources to help. I will go back to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. There's a lot of information in there. There is also the W3C tutorials and so on that have a lot of information. I also think, it's always, once you've learned this once, you can start to see the trends that are going on. We also do training and we can help. So we've got a team of access advisors who can help review them and check them for you. But there's a lot of resources out there already.
We're going to talk more about training in a minute.
Okay, cool.
To the next question, from Kitty, we are currently creating an MVP. There are lots of different types of accessibility. Which ones would have the highest impact? For example, colorblind contrast.
Okay, so Kitty, what I would say is there's lots of different types of accessibility. Yes, you're right. There's lots of different types of access needs. There's lots of different types of assistive technology. There's lots of different types of people who have a variety of different manifestations of, one condition. And what we often get is people say, well, what if we just focus on blind screen reader users? Well, that's great, but who decides who you're going to include and who you're going to exclude? My question here is, if we've got a set of guidelines, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, if we've got that set of guidelines that helps cover off all of the disabilities and all of the permutations and all of the access needs, if we just stick to those guidelines, then we don't need to argue about who we're going to include and who we're not going to include and who we should look at and who we shouldn't look at. And even further, the bonus with the web content accessibility guidelines is there's 3 levels. Level A, which is kind of like you must do these things. These are the highest priority. And these are the basic hygiene factors that must be done for fundamental accessibility compliance, I suppose. Then we have the level 2, so it's double A. You have to have all of those A's completed and then the double A's, okay? And that's where we suggest most of our clients try and aim for. And then we have triple A. Now, triple A is kind of like the gold standard or the platinum standard, I suppose. And I think if you can aim for the double A level of all of the web content accessibility guidelines, then you're going to be doing a very good job for a lot more people. And I would find it very difficult to just pick one checkpoint out of those web content accessibility guidelines to say to focus on.
Great answer. Okay, next one's from Gillian, and she says, I've found that the variety of devices older people use cause barriers too. Digital products don't always perform uniformly across iPhone, iPad, or Android devices, for instance. Is this something developers are considering?
So I hear you, and we have that problem too. So I think that developers do consider it, but I don't think maybe they're considering it to the depth that they might need to, if that makes sense. To be able to make something fully accessible, they have to be making sure that the Android app and the iPhone app are actually working as seamlessly as possible, but different devices have their quirks, and there's nothing you can really do about those device issues. We often have, when we do a review of an app, for example, if we are testing it on Apple, it does perfectly fine, but if we test it on Android, it's not doing so great. And sometimes that's just the maturity of the app in general. So it's hard, but they should be. I don't know if they are always, but developers should always be looking at all of those different permutations.
Okay, I'm going to jump to a question from John now, and he asks, a substantial number of older people will reach a point where they find it impossible to safely handle online financial security issues. Is there any good answer short of retaining access to personal banking services? So I think he's asking about older people and all of the security hurdles we now have to go through for online services.
It's a really good question, because what's really interesting is that in the new version of the web content accessibility guidelines, there is actually a new checkpoint that actually addresses the password issue. Okay, so without going into too much detail, it's not only the elderly people either. It's also a lot of people who have had traumatic brain injuries or who have, intellectual disabilities. There's all sorts of people who really struggle with getting access to systems. If I'm right, if you're sort of saying that they get to a point where they're not mentally capable of remembering the passwords, then hopefully we can work around that in the future and use more of the biometrics to access those details. But if it's more around the safety, online safety and so on, there are some real issues around that and how people can protect their data while allowing others to be able to access or support them in accessing those things. It's a huge topic, and yeah, it's a big one. So thank you for that one.
We had a couple of questions about where to find these guidelines. Are there links on your website if people go to Access Advisors?
Do you know what? I don't think we have a link to that on our website. However, I'm going to get the link to the WCAG, and I will put it in there momentarily.
Great. Well, I will send that out to everyone who's on this after it. Once you've got the link up there, you don't need to do it right now.
Okay, good.
Dr. Sally has agreed with you, buttons need names. She's also talked about the WCAG don't necessarily cover native, and that there was a task force on the W3C, which she was working on around mobile technologies. So I think you've kind of covered all of these points from people, which leads me to asking you two last questions. For businesses that are just beginning their accessibility journey, do you have a really good first step they should take?
I think the very first step that people should take is actually having a look at, oh no, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or reaching out to someone who knows the basics and who can help you. Just get familiar with the basic terminology so that then when you go to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, you know what you're looking for. What I would say is often people sort of say, oh, can you come and teach us how to be an accessibility specialist? And I'm like, sure we can, but it's not something that you can do overnight, right? I've been doing this for about 25 years now, and I certainly don't, I certainly know that there is still a lot of knowledge that needs to be, gained, if that makes sense. So sorry, yes, I am trying to do two things at once. My apologies. Stop, Chandra. That's my ADHD at work. Go for it. Say again.
Yeah, I'm just going to ask you, there's one more question in the Q&A that I thought would be worth passing on, which was who should own accessibility in a project team? Is it the project manager? Is it the product owner? Who is it that should own it?
It's a really good question. And I would say everyone has a responsibility right throughout any product team. Everybody has a responsibility. The person who should own it, that's a different story. I think that having an accessibility champion within any team is very important. So somebody who really knows their stuff so that they can help and be the voice of lived experience at every point. Now, whether that's the product owner, the product manager, or the designer, I don't know. It depends on the team. However, the product owner has a role to make sure that they are prioritizing accessibility. The product manager has a priority to ensure that there is time for each of the members to implement, but also check as we go. The designers need additional time and or capability to be making those design decisions. And the developers need that time and capability to be able to do that, as do the testers. So everybody has a responsibility, and I do believe the person who has the greatest accessibility knowledge or the person with the actual lived experience should be the owner of accessibility, as long as they have a voice that is listened to across the team.
Nice. Okay, last thing leads me to asking you, we are launching a series of workshops which you're going to be delivering, which is fantastic, through IT professionals. The first one is going to be about accessibility for digital leaders. Can you tell us all about what people will learn in that workshop?
Okay, so what we're going to do is that we're going to look at all of the different types of access needs, the impact that those digital needs have on the barriers, what the barriers are in the interface design. We're going to look at the assistive technology that people are using, the role that artificial intelligence is playing now as it's growing more and more. We're going to look at the business case, so evaluating the costs and the benefits to your business. So fundamentally answering your questions today, Vic, but in lots more detail. We're also going to be looking at how to evaluate the digital accessibility maturity of your organization. So where are you at now, and how can you move forward? And then helping you to create a little bit of a business case and a roadmap to help you reach those benefits and avoid the risks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today, Chandra. We covered so much. I want to use Dr. Sally's words. Thank you so much, Chandra. As usual, you are a star, that she's written in the Q&A. Really appreciate your time. Thanks to everyone who listened to this. We'll follow up with sending you some links, including to the workshop once we've got that up on the website for register, and links to the resources that Chandra was talking about today. So I'll let everyone get on with their day. Ka kite anō.
Ka kite. Thanks so much, Vic, for having me.